Alrighty, back to class. So one thing, by the way, just to celebrate as we go along. So we're starting module 4. So that means we've already covered 4 chapters, which is 1/4 of the course. So congratulations, you're a quarter of the way through. All right, so now we're going to be focusing this week on chapters 5 and 6. And I just realized I forgot to kind of bookmark them. But yeah, so be it. So this is the beginning of chapter 5. I do have that right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, chapter 5. And I'm really just going to focus on one figure here, Willhelm Wundt. A very, very important figure in psychology. And so, by the way, lest you think I'm pronouncing things funny, it's not me, it's the Germans. I can say that because I was born in Germany. I was actually born in Iserlohn, Germany. Although I'm more Dutch background than German, really. But in that part of the world, both Holland and Germany, they tend to pronounce their V's as W's and their W's as V's. So Willhelm Wundt is Willhelm Wundt. I am saying that correctly. All right, so here we go. Module 4a, Willhelm Wundt, the father of psychology. So one of the questions is, why is he the father of psychology? And let's just get to that right now. It's been kind of weird, and you've noticed, as I've been talking about it, I've been saying so-and-so is the, I don't know, I've been thinking of the previous people like a Fechner, let's say, as a psychologist, because they're clearly talking about psychology and they clearly influence psychology. And it is honestly a kind of blurry line about, when was psychology actually born? What event do you want to take as, fundamental to the birth of psychology? Because, there was no birth per se. There is no real birth date. So what we kind of mark things by is this: the opening of the first official psychology laboratory. So remember, I said last time that philosophy is kind of like theoretical psychology, right? Or let me say it this way: the real difference between psychology and philosophy is that in psychology we do experiments. We are very empirically minded. We want to confirm our theories. It's not that we don't have theories, but we want to confirm or disconfirm them through research, through experimentation. And so I think that's part of the reason why we kind of take the opening of the first empirical laboratory. So, the very first experimental studies of the mind. Although even that, you're going to see, we're going to twist what we mean by the word experimental a little bit. But clearly that was what the lab was set up to do. That's what labs are, right? They're empirical centers where you collect data to test theories. And so Wundt really set up the very first one dedicated to psychology in 1879. And that's part of the reason we say this is when psychology was born. But it's also partly because this is when psychology propagated, or thanks to Wundt, it propagated. So when he set up this lab, people interested in psychology came from all over the world. His was the place to study. If you were interested in psychology, and especially if you were swayed by some of those, remember those empiricists, those British empiricists we talked about, if that approach made sense to you, then the place to go was Wundt's lab. And many people did. And after they were in Wundt's lab and, learned all about his techniques and his methods, they then went back to the world, especially the USA, I highlight here, but to some extent to the world. And they opened up labs in their various locales. And so really his lab was the one that spawned all of the future labs. And so it really was, in that sense, the birth of the experimentation within psychology. Okay, and so that's why we often give him the title and mark the date as 1879 when his lab was open. A little arbitrary, but that gives you a sense. Okay, he is considered the most eminent psychologist of all time. There's a whole box in the textbook about measuring eminence. How do you do that? And by the way, we do that. Part of every scientist, if they get a raise every year, part of that is based on what we consider how eminent they are, how good of a scientist they are, and how can you measure that? We have ways of measuring that now. Things that are based on how many people are citing your papers and how good is the journals you publish in, and things like that. But however you measure it, Wundt ends up being the top dog every time. So, that's another big reason. He's had a really strong influence, and it's been a pretty wide influence, as you'll see. He touched on a bunch of different topics, and a lot of the topics that he kind of kicked off have spawned whole areas of research and whole different ways of looking at things. So, for that reason, he's had a very strong influence on both the birth of psychology through his lab, but also the variability in psychology that we see. Almost like Spencer talked about, things start simple and then they get complex and varied. He was the start of it, but he also started getting things complex and varied as well. Okay, we'll talk all that through. So here is the real interesting aspect, I think, of Wundt. When you think through, we're going to talk about how he loved introspection, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But because of that, and because he pushed this technique that a lot of subsequent psychologists weren't so sure about, they thought it might not be the most scientific, he became a sort of controversial subject, a controversial researcher to some extent. But he really wasn't. In his time, he was doing what everybody considered to be just really, really cool work that influenced so many. And yes, it got people thinking about techniques and procedures and maybe different or better ways of doing things. And then, because the world changes a little bit and suddenly sees things differently, they look back at his work and they're a little more critical. At the time, people weren't very critical. They were pretty impressed. And he got a lot of people thinking. Okay, so let's kind of work through this. And we really want to start with J.S. Mill again. I want to tie this back to J.S. Mill. I didn't emphasize this that much when I talked earlier about J.S. Mill, but I want to emphasize it now. And that's his idea of mental chemistry, because it's an idea that Wundt really kind of runs with. Mill was impressed by how in the chemical world, very complicated structures, very complicated elements, very complicated, molecules were built out of simple ones, right? So you could have something like two little hydrogen atoms, and they could connect with an oxygen, and now they form something new called H2O. They form water. So water is something that results when very simple things are added. So sometimes by combining very simple things, you get something new and different and more complicated. And in fact, we have the table of elements. How many elements are there? I should know this. You chemistry students do know this. I don't know it, actually. I'm gonna be honest with you. Wow, has it been a long time since I thought of the periodic table of elements. How many are there? 100? I don't know, but how many ever there are, my moment of embarrassment here, let's say there are 100. Everything in the world is built out of those 100 elements. Those are the basic building blocks of everything chemical. Okay. Willhelm Wundt thought the same principle might apply to psychology. That all of the complex cognitive things that are going on in our head might be built out of very simple elements. And one of his main goals, in fact, the main goal as an experimental psychologist, was to try to get at what those simple elements of psychology were. He kind of wanted to create a periodic table of elements for psychology. What are those basic things that combine to produce our subjective experience? And so that was his goal, was to find those basic elements. His procedure for doing that often relied on introspection. So we've heard back and forth as I've been talking about things that some people are really focused on psychology as conscious experience. We've had some people talk about there's more than just consciousness. There's stuff going on underneath consciousness. So Galton was talking about that amongst others. Wundt was really focused on conscious experience. So he's not going to talk too much about unconscious or other things. He's really kind of interested in, we have this world in our minds. What are the elements of that world? I want to figure out what those very simple elements are, and because once I know what those simple elements are, then I can start trying to figure out how they combine to produce certain kind of experiences. So he really, because it was the internal world, And because he wanted to know what the basic elements were, he used a technique called introspection, looking within yourself. Intro, within yourself. Spection, spectacles, spect has to do with vision. So looking inward. Now, he wanted to do this in the right way. So a lot of people had kind of watched their mind as it did things, or noticed, thought about their mind as they did things. Galton, we talked about memory too, how certain things brought things to his mind. He'd just look at something. So he was introspecting, he was paying attention to his mind. But Wundt made the strong distinction between two different approaches to introspection. One, which was more the Galton thing, which was self-observation, which is just kind of, we sometimes call this mindfulness, by the way, these days. This is an interesting thing to kind of connect with mindfulness. This is 1800s. We think of mindfulness as this new thing. Well, Wundt is kind of about mindfulness in a formal way. But he would say the first one is kind of like what some of us call about mindfulness, just paying attention to what's going on in your mind. So he thought this was a common thing that we all do every now and then, kind of look inward, but that it was that we and everything we believed and thought was very caught up in what we saw in our mind. So he thought there were lots of biases that were connected to the individual that was introspecting. So he thought if we want to get scientific, we have to kind of get past those personal biases. We have to learn to observe things in a much more clinical, antiseptic way. So he actually trained people how to introspect. That would have been the first step if you entered his lab, is to go through a formal process of learning how to properly introspect. And he thought this involved the deliberate observation of one's own mental processes. And if it was done right, that it could produce useful data. But you really had to do things right. And so this is a big part of, by the way, why Wundt started the lab, right? He was very methodologically rigorous. And he knew it was a challenge to ask people to look within their minds. And he really wanted to come up with some very clear, specific procedures people could do to hopefully introspect in ways that produced useful data. So ways that got around the person's biases and such. And so this metronome over to the left gives an example. Now, wow, I should have kind of kicked up a little metronome. We will in just a second. We'll give it a go. You'll see my horrible desktop in just a moment. I'm worried already. What you see on the left here is an old-fashioned metronome. And so this little arm just goes back and forth. And it goes back and forth at a different speed depending on where you slide that weight. So that this thing right here is a weight, and you can put it up or you can put it down. The higher it is, the slower this swings. The lower it is, the faster it swings. Okay, so you can adjust how quick it swings, and it intentionally is made so that when it swings, it clicks. Every time it changes direction, it clicks. So it comes click, 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 and that arm just swings back and forth and clicks that way. Okay, so it's something that musicians have used very often to keep time. If you're playing some musical instrument and you have this going in the background, then you can lock your timing onto that. Okay, we don't use these kind of metronomes very much nowadays. We have digital versions, but that's what Wundt used. And so he would have these in his lab, and they would be very important to setting the stage of introspection, because he would do things like the following. He would have the metronome going either very slowly or very, very quickly. And he would ask his trained observers, because everybody that he got data from had to be trained, he would ask them to listen very closely to those clicks and to pay attention to what they're actually hearing in their mind. What does this sound like in your mind? So let's jump to here. He claimed that initially you do something called apprehension. So you apprehend the individual beats. Click, click, click. Okay. And one of the things he was interested in, by the way, this is just one of the many things that he's kind of kicked off, was what was the span? How many clicks could a person hold in their mind as it was going click, click, click? And what he found is they could kind of hold 6. And then once they got beyond 6, it was too much for them to mentally hold. This is what we now call working memory, the span of working memory. And there's a famous paper by George Miller called The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2, where, in a much more recent time, Miller did the same thing, tried to see how many things a person could hold in mind at one time. And he found the number was on average 7, some less, some better, so plus or minus 2. Which is pretty darn close to Wundt 100 years earlier, nailing it down at 6. Okay, so that's just a little spurious thing with Wundt. Oh, by the way, he measured this 100 years before. A famous paper measured it. But here's what Wundt was really interested in. He thought it was very hard for the mind to just hear those individual beats as they were, but that the mind would in fact try to somehow extract meaning from those beats, even though at the lowest level they're just click, 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 that somehow the mind would try to organize it. One of the things he highlighted, by the way, is because we're so used to clocks being around, when we talk about a clock, what do we talk about? We talk about it, what's the sound it makes? Do we say tick, 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 tick? No, that's probably is the sound it makes. What we say is tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. We feel like there's a rhythm going on there. Not just a bunch of clicks, but that they're kind of organized into twos, which suggest a tick, tock, kind of thing you could dance to. Okay, and so this is what he thought was interesting, how the mind is taking the input and organizing it. And he thought that we draw heavily on past experiences. So if we've heard clocks doing the tick-tock thing, then that's the way we organize regular beats. We turn them into rhythms. And that's what he said people would do. And so let me just stop there for a second. We're going to get a little more complex, but to stop there for a second and say that was, his notion that if you're a really good observer, you can listen to that sound and you can say, yep, it's now sounds like a tick-tock. My mind has organized them into whatever. And so that good observers could really turn inward in a dispassionate way and attend and tell you what they're seeing or hearing. This is one example of that. Okay, so now let's take it a little more complex and get a little closer to that sort of mental chemistry we talked about earlier. So here's a couple of conditions. Now, first of all, let me just highlight something cool. A couple of conditions. Let me just put both of these. Fast versus slow, he's going to look at. We're starting to get experiments here, right? If you may not have really thought about it this way, but up until this point, almost nothing that we've talked about has involved any sort of contrast between two conditions, like a control group and an experimental group. It's almost always just been, hey, somebody showed something, and they think it means this. But when we start to compare two different conditions, now we're getting closer to sort of causal experiments, because we know the only thing different about those conditions is what we manipulated. So if we see a different response, we can start to think it's due to what we manipulated. So we're seeing the beginning of a proper experimental method right here. Okay, I shouldn't say proper, a modern experimental method. There's nothing that suggests we're doing it right now. We may find a better way, but this is a more modern approach. So let me just back up a little bit and start with this one condition. So he would have the metronome do one beat every 2 seconds. That's pretty slow. Okay, and he asked people just to listen to this and tell me what you hear, what you feel, if what goes on in your mind when you're listening to this. And he found that without letting any observers know what he expected ahead of time, they would very commonly report that it kind of made them feel depressed or sad or tired or slow, de-energized, so to speak. If you did the same thing, but you made it much faster, 3 beats per second, holy. That's really fast. Then it bred excitement. Let's try this. Here we go. I'm sorry. Here's my horrible desktop with everything I have going on, but there must be a digital metronome. And let's just feel these things, shall we? No, I don't want to buy one. I want one. Oh, I don't want an app. There, thank you. My goodness. What? Oh my goodness, how is this such a complex metronome? I just want something that goes click, click, click. Okay, online metronome. Problem is I said digital and there we go. Thank you very much. So let's do the first one. What was that? A beat every 2 seconds. How many beats per minute is that? 30. 30 beats per minute. It won't even go that low. So let's do 40. Here's 40. So the claim is, as you listen to this, first of all, do you hear a tick-tock or a tick-tick? So if you hear the tick-tock, that's that sort of organizational structure. But the claim is that if you listen to this long enough, you would start to get a little sad, depressed, versus 3 beats per second. That's 180 beats per minute. Okay, here's the fast condition. All right, so the claim is here, it's energizing. It's getting you a little stirred up. I mean, I'm bouncing here, right? So what a simple kind of thing we're talking about here, right? Some level, it's a very simple stimulation, but imagine people in Wundt's lab sitting and listening to this and noting what was going on in their mind. And what he actually did with simple observations like this, his idea was, you know what, maybe I've discovered a basic element here, like excitement versus boredom. Maybe that's one characteristic of that basic chemistry, though. Maybe I found an element of a sort of psychological element that contributes to other things. And as he kind of did these experiments, and we don't have time to unpack it totally, but when he did these experiments with the metronome, he found that there were sort of 3 dimensions, or you can think of these as elements. Again, notice by the way we're using opposites, right? Which was right back to what the heck was that? Hard to remember. You guys know this better than I do now. I think it was down to Plato was big on the opposites, right? And so we have pleasure, displeasure, excitement and calm, strain and relaxation. These are just polar opposites. But he thought these 3, so we've talked about calm versus excitement here, that was one manipulation. But as he played with different manipulations, he found that they would give rise to different, well, he kind of nailed these different elements. And ultimately, what he was claiming is that just about any experience you might have now could be described as some combination of those 3 elements. So I like to ride my motorcycle. I find it makes me feel relaxed. And yet it's still kind of exciting, but it gives me pleasure. It makes me happy. It makes me feel good. So there's some combination of relaxation, certainly not strain. Excitement and calm's kind of interesting on a motorcycle because it's sort of a mix of the two. It's often calm until something happens, and that brings you up to excitement, and then it brings you back to calm. But again, the idea is that we could take some experience, and riding a motorcycle is too complicated, but we could present some more complicated stimuli to you, and it would produce a feeling inside of you. And if we told you, there's these 3 elements, if you had to say how excited or calm you are right now, and how relaxed or strained you feel, and how much pleasure or displeasure do you feel, you would find you would put this somewhere. You'd say, it gives me this much pleasure, this much strain, etc. And that often participants were very consistent in how they rated things. And so this was his attempt. I just really want you to kind of get that understanding. This was his attempt to produce this sort of mental chemistry where you could find these elements and talk about how they were combined. By the way, it turns out that this simple, combination of 3 factors is used to explain many things and does a really good job of doing it. So it's called this tridimensional theory of feeling. So this is where subjective feeling comes from, right? Emotion, the emotion that a stimulation produces to you. And this has been applied successfully in all kinds of areas since Wundt. And he came to it by listening to a metronome and having people listen to a metronome. So, I mean, I think it really does kind of capture Wundt in a good way, because it's all the methodological rigor, but he's trying to explain big things like feelings, and how feelings arise. And he feels you can do that through introspection if you do things in a structured and formal enough way. So formal you need labs to do it and procedures. And that's why he created his lab and came up with his procedures that everyone else then wanted to learn. Okay, I want to tell you about another one, and this is an important one to me. The textbook talks about the original version of this, which is all about pleasantness here. So on this axis, you'll see in the textbook it says pleasantness. I'm kind of using a slightly different version, but there's a guy named Berline, U of T prof, who loved this curve and kind of took it further. And so, I like some of the things that have come with it, and they find it applies to all sorts of things. So what is this curve? Well, basically what it says is very often we like things at some middle level. So hedonic value, this is sort of how pleasant it is, how pleasing it is to you. And so the example they give you in a textbook is something like the following. Imagine you're in the car, and they actually say the stereo is off, but imagine it's on, but it's on very quietly. Sometimes when it's on very quietly, it's not very pleasing. You can barely hear it, right? It's sometimes even partially annoying. What are they saying on the radio? If you turn it up, you will find you'll get to a point where you like that there. Now I can hear it well, and so I like it quite well at that volume. If you continue to turn it up, it doesn't continue to get better. It reaches a point where it starts to feel too loud, too much, and so you don't like it. And the louder it gets, the less you like it still. So Wundt said a lot of things follow this pattern of there's some middle level of intensity that's the most desirable, and lower levels or higher levels are less desirable. It's called the Wundt Curve. Let me mention the Berline kind of combination of it and how it fits into things like, well, you guys all know I care about skill development, skills like critical thinking, creative thinking, and I want you guys to learn those things. And I feel you have to practice. I mean, that's the only way skills develop, is by practicing. But the first time when you start doing a skill, when you start practicing it, you're not very good to begin with. And in those first original practices, you don't get a lot of pleasure. So imagine now we're talking about the amount of practice. You don't get a lot of pleasure from that original practice. Or let's think of pleasure a little differently, because this is what people do with the curve. Let's not really think of it as pleasure. Let's think of it as sort of return on investment, which probably gives you pleasure. But what I mean by that is, let's say you pick up a guitar and you say, I want to learn guitar. And so you start taking some lessons and noodling around, and you're putting in a lot of time and effort, and you're not seeing your guitar playing change all that much. Very little increase in your proficiency. And so early on, working through a new skill, the payoff for the time you spend is kind of small. And it starts to feel like, oh man, this is going to take forever. And quite often people quit somewhere around here, some new skill. Think of all the sports you might have started, or musical instruments you started to learn, or martial arts. It's very common that we do it for a while. We put a bunch of time and effort into it. We feel like we're not getting better. And so we quit. But what this has been extended to is skill learning, and it shows the same thing. Yeah, but the longer you stay in it, if you can keep with the practice, the payback gets better and better and better. So we'll go to this point first of all. So, if you continue to practice that guitar, then slowly over time you start to feel the improvement. And then the more you practice, the more improvement you feel. And that gets really fun then. Then you feel like you're improving a lot. And so in a lot of the cases when it comes to skills, the argument is that we have to get the student past this point. And how do we do that? Well, sometimes by making them practice, which is a tricky thing, because if you make somebody do something, then they naturally don't want to do it. So you want to try to make them do it without making them hate it. So, in Pure Scholar, I try to make you think critically. I try to make you think creatively. And I'm trying to push you through that a little bit, because once you get good at it, it gets fun. But that first period you got to get through. Now, what about over here? Well, this is like a guitar player who's put in a bunch of time, got a bunch better, and now it's not really that they're going to get worse if they continue practicing, but they're not going to feel like they're gaining much more anymore. Like at some point, the amount of gain you get from additional practice declines. And so if you're like, Jimi Hendrix, you can practice for hours. You're already so dang good that you're not going to get a whole lot better. And so, in the practice curve, that's how it kind of goes. In some situations, it makes sense to talk about it actually becoming unpleasant over time. And in fact, most really good musicians stop practicing. They don't enjoy practicing. They don't feel like they're getting much payback, and they don't enjoy it. So anyway, just a kind of interesting thing that Wundt played with as well, that has now been applied in many different contexts. Okay. Let's go here. And I also want to just highlight this part, and it's true of Fechner as well. And so this is actually a Fechner quote, but it's something that Wundt pushed in a slightly different form, but pretty similarly. It's this notion of what they called psychophysical parallelism. We almost now call it neuroscience, but the idea is, you sometimes hear things like this: the mind is what the brain does, right? The brain is the organ. It does stuff, and that gives rise to thoughts, or our mind, our conscious existence. And so some people have taken that very seriously and said there is a parallelism, that in fact, as people are thinking, there's parts of their mind that they're using. And so these two things are directly connected in some way, which means that if you could ever watch the brain, you could maybe watch the mind, right? You'd see brain stuff doing things. In fact, there are researchers doing just that right now, using brain scans to watch the mind. We've talked about one in a previous lecture, right? When we were looking at people in vegetative states and how they can use a brain scan to kind of know what the person's thinking. So this notion that the brain and the mind were so interconnected was originally championed by Fechner. So he said there's no psychical process, from the simplest sensation to affective elements, feelings, to the most complex thought process, which does not run parallel with a physical process. So he says those things in our mind, those psychical things, all have a physical basis. And this is the age we're in. This is what we call cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive being the mind, neuroscience being the brain. We buy that totally. And 100 years ago, the first psychologist bought it as well. Okay. Now, everything I've talked to you about so far has been the sort of empirical side of Wundt. But he was kind of interesting because, he was interested in all sorts of things. And one of the things he'd done is traveled. And so he'd interacted with many people in different cultures. Plus, he'd read a lot about cultures and learned a lot about cultures. And of course, there's still that shadow of Darwin, right? Darwin has been floating around all through the 1800s, and everybody, during that time couldn't help but being influenced by Darwin's idea. So Wundt said, you can't study everything in the lab, that some things you can only study in the world and through observation. So it's not like he thought everything had to be lab-based. And so he really started something we now call cultural or cross-cultural psychology. He was interested in how different cultures might think about things differently. How their mentality, how their mind might work differently because of the culture. So specifically, he kind of bought into Darwin's ideas. He said, okay, we could adopt Darwin's methodology. So Darwin was looking at variations of species. But we can also look at variations within a species, within the human species, maybe, and say, okay, within that, we're seeing different cultural groups. And these groups, though, do certain things that represent their collective consciousness. Let me get back to that collective consciousness a bit. But we could look at their different collective consciousnesses and learn a little bit about why that way of thinking about things emerged, given their cultural environment. So, cultural variations, he thought, are shaped by the cultural environment. So, if you grow up in a different place, with different belief systems or different political structures or different historical histories, that's your environment. And the fact that your environment may be different from somebody else suggests that your mindset may evolve differently. And so we could come up with different groups of humans that sort of think about the world in very different ways. How do you know how a group thinks about the world? Well, this is what Wundt looked at. So these are the ways he got at what he called the collective consciousness. So let's take a culture. Let's say, well, I won't take Canada because Canada is such a mix of cultures. It's tricky. I'm going to go with more of a monoculture. So let's say like Japan. If you imagine a place like Japan, I picked Japan partly because it's an island, right, which makes it a real more of a petri dish almost, you can consider it. And so what he would say is, let's say we looked at the Japanese culture and we're interested in how it might be different than the British culture, let's say. And so how are there things about those cultures that reflect the way people think within them? And he said, yes, there are. Specifically, he liked to highlight the way they use language, the mythology that emerges from that culture, which includes their arts, their myths, and their religions, and the moral system connected with that culture, which you can see through their laws, both their formal laws, and by culture he means the sort of the way people behave. Let me give you an example of this that's kind of freaky. Remember when the tsunami hit Japan? You probably don't remember. I keep forgetting how young you guys are, and that things that seem like it was yesterday to me might have been while you were 3 years old. But there was a tsunami that hit Japan, and it swept a bunch of people out to sea. It caused a whole whack of damage, including a nuclear power plant that became very dangerous in its own right. During this whole thing, I remember a CNN episode, and somebody was on the ground in Japan, and they were talking to a reporter, and that reporter was saying, the anchor asked him, he said, are people panicking in Japan because we know there's limited food supplies and limited water, and people must be panicking? And the reporter kind of said, well, I mean, I guess, but to the extent Japanese people panic, he said, I mean, they're still in orderly lines, being very polite, lining up for water, lining up for food. So he's like, they're not like going crazy, if that's what you mean by panic, but Japanese people don't do that. They're very measured and calm in their reactions to things. Okay, so that he would call their culture, the fact that when there's a lineup for something precious, how do the people within that culture react? And in the Japanese culture, they react in a very orderly, sort of polite manner. In a different culture, they might not be so orderly or polite. Okay, so what Wundt is saying then is these are all things we can see. You can go find the mythology of the culture. You can look at what sort of drama they do, what sort of myths they have, and what their religion is. So these are all things that are in books on paper. And so he thought that if you studied these things across culture, you could learn a little bit about these different collective consciousnesses that reflect the way people think, feel, and act in those places, with language really reflecting the thinking, and the feeling being more the mythology, and the volitional, what's considered appropriate actions reflect the moral system. So he wanted to compare different cultures on these grounds, but he didn't think you could do that experimentally, right? The culture was what the culture was. All you could do is observe the data that came in a more natural way. Okay, so all of this to say, first of all, Wundt had very wide interests, as you get a sense here. He's made an impact in multiple areas. He certainly adopted an experimental approach to psychology, but at the same time, he didn't say this was the only way to do things. He thought the appropriate way to address some problem depended on the problem. And sometimes experimental methods were the right approach. Sometimes more like an observational approach was the right approach. It depended on the question. And yes, he very much adopted introspection as a method. That will come up over and over again as we continue, as some people take issue with his use of introspection. Okay. That's Wundt. All good. So we are now sort of partway through chapter 5, and I will continue on, I think, with 2 more lectures on chapter 5, and then 2 or 3 on chapter 6. So stay tuned. Alrighty. See you guys. Bye-bye.